Your Excellency Belinda Lewis, British Ambassador to the State of Kuwait, Dr. Mohammed Ramadan, Director of the Research Directorate at the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences, esteemed speakers and expert panel members, honored guests, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this event, Climate Change and the Risks it Poses on the World's Hottest Sea, a topic whose importance cannot be overstated. My name is Dr. Bassam Shhebar, and I will be your host and moderator throughout this evening's program. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that there will be a survey available at the end for you all to fill out, which we respectfully ask of you so that we may continue to improve upon the organization of future events. We'll start things off with some pre-recorded opening remarks from Dr. Mohammed Ramadan, followed by Her Excellency Belinda Lewis. So please, if we may start with the first video.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Lewis, honorable dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this important event titled Climate Change and the Risk It Poses to the World's Hottest Sea, which is organized by the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences, CFAS, in collaboration with the British Embassy in Kuwait and in coordination with the Center for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science, CFAS. For the past few years, CFAS and the British Embassy have worked closely together on capacity building initiatives and advocacy in science, technology and innovation of the local, regional and global significance. This collaboration has proven to be very fruitful, and we look forward to continuing our partnership in promoting science and innovation, especially in building the competencies needed to address challenges that are facing our time. One of these challenges is climate change. There is little doubt that climate change poses a very serious and sustained threat to global environment and global development. Its impact and costs are clearly felt by our communities as well as we witness intense and extreme climate-related events with implications ranging from damages in infrastructure to the livelihood and sustainability of our communities. Economies are also becoming vulnerable, especially those that depend on natural resources due to the consequences of climate change-related events. In November of this year, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, will be held in Glasgow, hosted by the United Kingdom. This event presents an important opportunity for global leaders to find means and foster change, especially in relation to transforming climate policy, as well as potentially agreeing on a unified roadmap and approach to addressing the challenges of climate change. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, we at CFAS have been supporting the enhancement of the local innovation ecosystem, especially in building the competencies of our stakeholders to foster innovative solutions towards global challenges such as climate change. As part of the new CFAS strategy, the Foundation has continued to invest in international partnerships and collaborations that catalyze the enhancement and the advancement of science and technology transfer, as well as strengthen evidence-based policy making for the national and regional development. This includes facilitating discussions between decision makers, researchers, and practitioners to derive more effective solutions to national challenges. This is all possible due to the generous contributions of the local Kuwaiti private companies that continue to support CFAS, as well as the leadership and guidance of His Highness the Emir, Sheikh Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Nawaf Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Subah, who delegated the chairmanship of CFAS board of directors to His Highness the Crown Prince, Sheikh Mish'al Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Subah. For the past few weeks, CFAS has been working closely with CFAS to organize this event. I would like to extend my gratitude and thanks to our distinguished speaker from the UK, the British Embassy in Kuwait, and the prominent panel. I wish you all much success and look forward to hearing the outcomes of these important discussions and deliberations. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't join you for the seminar, but I did want to at least send a few thoughts and reflections about this incredibly important topic that you've all gathered to discuss and share ideas on. I grew up in Newcastle upon Tyne, next to the sea, next to the North Sea, and some of my strongest childhood memories are of paddling in the sea and looking out across the horizon and just admiring the beauty of being able to see as far as the sky, which in what seemed to me at the time a big city like Newcastle was a very rare thing. So this sense of the health and beauty of the sea, the importance of the ocean, is something that feels as though it's part of me. And one of the wonderful things about living here in Kuwait is that I can see the Gulf, I can see the sea from my terrace, and it's something that I care about deeply, about preserving for my children. And I think that's what all of us think about in terms of climate change. Part of it is about the economy, it's about the air that we breathe, the quality of that air, about all sorts of things that affect our lives, but increasingly not just our lives, the lives of our children or of our extended family, of our grandkids. It's the steps that we take now that will preserve their future and will have a huge direct impact on the quality of life that they are able to enjoy. So I do hope that my own children, my two little girls and grandchildren, if I'm fortunate to have any, are able to paddle in the North Sea safely, that coastline is still there, that it isn't eroded, that if I have family members who come to Kuwait in the future, which I certainly hope that they do, that they can stand on the terrace here and look out and admire the beauty of the Gulf as well. So what I would say is it's kind of maybe a well-worn expression. This isn't just for us. It isn't just for people in neighbouring countries who maybe have fewer tools than we have to try and address these issues. It's for the future generations, and the steps that we take now will either ruin or safeguard their future. So I hope you enjoy the seminar. Again, I'm sorry that I can't join you, but I look forward to hearing more about the discussions and conclusions and recommendations that come out of it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry, we're having a few technical problems, but I've been asked to come on stage and introduce myself. My name's Dr. John Pinniger. I'm from CFAS in the UK. I'm also an author on the next IPCC climate change assessment that will appear in January and February next year, that will talk about the impacts of climate change around the world. Let's just check if people can. Yes, people can hear me. Good. Okay, in that case, I'll start my presentation and move on then. Okay, good. Hopefully people can see my slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk about climate change and risks that it poses in the world's hottest sea. This piece of work was carried out on behalf of ROPME, which is the Regional Seas Convention that covers most GCC countries and the whole of the Gulf area and the northern part of the Arabian Sea. I thought I would start by introducing CFAS. So CFAS, the place where I work, is an executive agency of the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which means that we're all civil servants, part of the ministry in the UK. We were established in 1902 specifically to study the fisheries of the North Sea, and it later evolved to work on marine environmental issues more generally, including looking at pollution, harmful algal blooms, as well as fisheries and aquaculture. We have about 550 staff at two main laboratories in Lowestoft on the east coast and in Weymouth on the south coast. We have a very large research vessel that you can see there, the CFAS Endeavour. But in recent years, we've gone from being very domestically focused on UK waters to working all around the world, and especially so in GCC countries and small island states. And we have an office in Kuwait associated with the embassy. And until COVID, we also had an office in the Oman embassy as well. So that's a little bit about CFAS. Within CFAS, about 4 or 5 years ago, we created something called the International Marine Climate Change Centre that brings together all of our expertise on climate change. And that can include everything from fisheries and climate change through to work on carbon, blue carbon, emissions from shipping and from fishing, effects of climate change on human diseases, all sorts of things. Again, we work all around the world, but particularly in the ROPME region, in the Caribbean and in the UK overseas territories, as well as around the British Isles. So I'm the lead advisor at CFAS on climate change, and we have what we call a memorandum of understanding with the UK government to provide advice on the seas and climate change. We provide advice to government, and also I'm an author on the IPCC, particularly the chapter on small island states. Okay. So the work that I'm going to describe is on behalf of ROPME, which is the regional organisation for the protection of the marine environment. And it covers the area you can see in the map there. Generally, we call the area the ROPME Sea area, and it's divided into the inner ROPME Sea area, which is the Gulf, the middle ROPME Sea area, sort of around the Straits of Hormuz, and then the outer ROPME Sea area, which is the northern part of the Arabian Sea. It includes the 8 countries you can see there, and the UK has been working with ROPME for quite a while now as part of something called the UK Gulf Marine Environment Partnership. We were asked to work with ROPME particularly on a climate change strategy because I've been involved previously in the UK climate change risk assessment. So in the UK, we have a climate change law that says every 5 years we have to produce a risk assessment of all sectors of the economy, saying which sectors are the most at risk from climate change. And I've been involved in the last 3 of these, writing everything to do with marine and fisheries. So through ROPME, we've been producing a regional marine climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy. In 2013, ROPME highlighted in their State of the Marine Environment report that there was a need to undertake a much more detailed examination of climate change risks across the region. And they particularly wanted a regional marine climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy. And this was launched in 2019. So the products that we've helped to produce so far are a climate change evidence report, where we've tried to document everything we can find out about climate change in the region, a climate change risk assessment, which I'll describe in a few moments, and a blue carbon inventory. So that's trying to quantify where all the seagrasses, the mangroves, the algal beds are across the whole region. And all of those are available on the ROPME website. And on the last slide of my presentation, I'll show a QR code that you can just scan and it'll take you directly to those documents. So the first thing that we produced was an evidence report. You can see a link at the bottom of the page there. So this was a very large document detailing everything we know about climate change in the region. Particularly, we do talk about each of the subregions, so the inner, the middle, and the outer ROPME Sea area. And then there is an online, much shorter, glossy version that you can see, the blue document there, in multiple languages, that summarizes that much longer document. It's a very useful sort of quick look at how climate change is affecting the region. So in the title of the talk, we talked about the world's hottest sea. The Gulf has been identified as the warmest water body in the world by numerous authors. And in fact, I found a paper only last week that reported satellite imagery data for the Gulf showing that the sea surface temperature regularly goes above 36 degrees C, which is hotter than anywhere else in the world. And in particular, there was an extreme seawater temperature of 37.6 degrees C was reached on 30th of July in Kuwait Bay at an offshore station. So that's why we're calling it the world's hottest sea. And what you can see in that little strip of color there, this is quite a nice illustration of how the average climate has changed over the past 100 or so years. And it shows the average temperature for each year. And you can see that in recent years, the temperature has been much hotter than any other time in the last 100 years, and particularly in the last 5 years. A little bit of a summary of the things that we found in the evidence report. So in terms of temperature, the inner ROPME Sea area, so that includes the area around Kuwait, is already one of the warmest seas in the world. As I say, it's regularly above 36 degrees C. So surface temperatures from the models could rise by another 2.8 to 4 degrees C over the next 100 years. So it could get extremely warm. In terms of salinity, the high evaporation rate tends to lead to very saline waters, and salinity has increased by between 0.5 and 1% over the last 60 years. Ocean acidification, so this is how the pH of the water. So far, there's only limited evidence for change, but the pH is predicted to decrease by about 0.25 units over the next sort of 2050, which it doesn't sound a lot, but that's actually quite a big change in acidity and could affect animals like corals. In the outer ROPME Sea area, not so much in the Gulf, but in the outer ROPME area, there's a problem with proliferation of low oxygen areas. Areas of low oxygen are expected to become much larger and more persistent in the future. Then there's tropical storms and cyclones. The number of severe tropical cyclones in the outer ROPME Sea area and the Straits of Hormuz may increase by the end of the century. And in fact, there was a hurricane came through, although it was only Category 1, hit the coast of Oman only last week. Monsoons, there are predictions that the monsoon seasonality will change. The projections for 2100 suggest a weakening of the Indian monsoon in the Arabian Sea. And finally, sea level rise. Sea level rise is pretty much locked in now because of the emissions that we've already emitted. And sea level rise of about 2.2 millimeters per year is estimated for the inner ROPME Sea area, including the area around Kuwait. So there's some of the headline messages in terms of the sort of physics and chemistry that we're expecting in the next 50 or so years. I've put a few slides together now showing some of the more sort of biological changes that we anticipate. So a lot of the work that we looked at focused on coral reefs, and you can see some little icons at the top that show the sorts of the evidence that exists for coral reefs. But there's already been a rapid decline in coral reefs across most of the ROPME Sea area in the last 2 decades. It's been linked to all sorts of climate pressures, but particularly to widespread coral bleaching. So that's when the temperature in particular peaks. And as we saw, there was a peak in Kuwait last year and stays at a sustained level, high level for a period. It causes the corals to emit the algae that grows within them. And so they go white rather than this sort of greenish color that you can see there. And then they can no longer feed and reproduce properly. In future decades, the predictions are that most of the reefs and the corals within the inner ROPME Sea area, including around Kuwait, will be under threat from the combined effects of warming, ocean acidification, and other local stressors. Harmful algal blooms are another big issue that came up in our evidence report. Harmful algal blooms are already occurring throughout I'm not sure if people can still hear me.
We apologize for the technical difficulties we're experiencing right now, and we'll try to reconnect with Dr. Pinniger as soon as possible. Your patience is greatly appreciated. Thank you. It looks like he's back.
Can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, good. So harmful algal blooms are another issue that came up a lot in our study. They're already occurring all throughout the Gulf area. The links to climate change are not entirely clear, but they do seem to be increasing in scale and persistence. And one of the issues with this is that, as well as they can be dangerous to human health, they can also block the cooling water intakes of desalination plants and power stations and things like that. They've also caused mass mortality of fish and other organisms throughout the region. But as I say, the link to climate change is not entirely clear. And finally, I just wanted to say something about fisheries and fisheries. Up to 10% of the fish species occurring in the inner ROPME Sea area are predicted to potentially become regionally extinct by the end of the century as a result of increasing temperature. Fish within the Gulf are already the most heat-adapted fish anywhere on the planet. There aren't other species that can tolerate warmer temperatures. But also the productivity of pelagic fish, so things like tuna and sardine, are predicted to decline throughout the region. And in the outer ROPME Sea area, so off the coast of Oman, particularly the expansion of oxygen minimum zones is predicted to be a big problem. And already we know that if there are changes in coral reefs, then you will see changes in the reef fish assemblages associated with them. And in 2020, over the next year or so, ROPME have asked us to do a more detailed study into the impacts of climate change onto fish and fisheries in the region. So I'll now talk a little bit about the process that we've been through in terms of the risk assessment. So the first thing is, from the evidence report that we prepared, we came up with what we call a long list of key risks. So this was 15 risks to biodiversity and habitats and 30 risks to economy and society. And you can see just little symbols here that sort of denote the sorts of things we're talking about. So on the biodiversity, it's things like corals, it's also seabirds, mammals, different types of fish, impacts on benthic animals that live on the bottom, impacts on jellyfish. And in terms of economy, its impacts on fisheries infrastructure, on power stations, on sewage works, but even things like on education, on recreation, on sort of underlying genetic resources that are available, all sorts of things, a very long list of potential risks. And the purpose of the risk assessment is to take all of these very contrasting things and try and rank them in terms of which are the most important for the region. So the way we did this is that after we had that long list, we called an expert meeting in Oman in November 2019 and invited 16 technical experts from every country within the ROPME Sea area based on their work and experience. They narrowed down that list to 23 biodiversity risks and 22 societal ones. So they split some of the biodiversity ones and lumped together some of the society ones. And then for each of those, they were scored in terms of proximity or urgency, and I'll say how in a moment, and magnitude. And we also scored them in terms of confidence. So they were assigned a score based on the level of agreement and the level of evidence. So in terms of the confidence scoring, we used a scheme that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came up with. So we use this matrix here of the amount of evidence on the left-hand side, and then the agreement on the bottom side and the bottom there. And you can see we basically picked a cell from this matrix. So in the top right-hand corner, there's high agreement and robust evidence. In the bottom left, there is low agreement and limited evidence. So we didn't use this in the overall scoring and the ranking, but it was useful just to work out where the evidence gaps were in the assessment. In terms of proximity, when we talk about proximity, we mean how urgent it is. So we scored each risk in terms of, is it happening now, in which case it would get a score of 4. Is it likely to happen in the next 20 years or the next 50 years or over 50 years, in which case it's less urgent and it got a score of 1. So that's urgency or proximity. And then there's magnitude. This is a little difficult to read, but so magnitude or the severity was based on a scoring either in terms of economic, environmental or social concerns. And what I'm showing in the little table here is the example for environmental. And so the high that got a score of 3, for example, are really major risks to biodiversity that cause huge proportion of the population to decline, very large areas, multiple countries. Whereas the ones that are green and get a score of 1 are very localized changes where only a few little populations might change. And so you then put the proximity or urgency scores together with the magnitude scores. There's a little bit of a calculation, and then you have a ranking. So the lowest ranking possible is 8.3, and the highest ranking is 100. And any score that was over 60 was considered severe. So if we look now at which particular ones came out high, so these are the rankings for biodiversity across the ROPME Sea area. This is the whole biodiversity list. And you can see that some of the things that were at the top for the whole ROPME area were things like harmful algal blooms, coral reefs, dugongs in this one, but dugongs was below the 60%, the 60 score, phytoplankton, jellyfish, pelagic fish, a whole lot of different issues there. But if I look at the inner ROPME Sea area, so the area around Kuwait, it's a slightly different list. Again, harmful algal blooms came out top, coral reefs, changes on the phytoplankton. So that means that if the productivity of the ocean itself goes down, then it can support many fewer fish and other animals. Corals, the actual corals themselves came out high. Dugongs were high there as well. But overall, if you put everything together, including the socioeconomic risks, these are the 12 most severe risks for the whole ROPME Sea area. So both the inner, middle, and outer ROPME Sea area. So the risk that came out as highest was damage to coral reefs. Already we're seeing coral reefs across the whole area. Harmful algal blooms, we're seeing those already, and they can have huge impacts on both people and industries. Impacts on coastal communities, there's all sorts of things wrapped up in that, but it included some health issues. Fisheries, impacts on the infrastructure and the actual operation of fishing, not the distribution of fish. Impacts on through flash flooding of infrastructure. Desalination plants, so the blocking of desalination plants, things like that. Industry and energy impacts, disruption to transport, plankton productivity, coral health, so that includes coral bleaching and diseases. Jellyfish, we're already seeing a bit of a proliferation of jellyfish, and the impacts on shellfish, particularly around reductions in the oxygen concentration of the water. So they're the 12 severe risks that we identified across the whole ROPME Sea area. So there were some issues that we had very, very long debates about. So for example, we had a very long debate about dugongs. Dugongs really only occur in the inner ROPME Sea area around Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, which hosts internationally important populations of dugong, second only to Australia. And they're indirectly affected by climate change impacts on the seagrass. But because dugongs were not present in the middle or the outer sea area, they got a lower overall score, and so they didn't come out in the top ranking of the top 12 risks. But they did come out as within the inner ROPME Sea area. So within each of the 3 areas of the ROPME region, you do get different lists, a different list of priority scores. So that's all I was going to say, really. It was an introduction to the risk assessment. You can go online, you can scan this little QR code, and it'll take you directly to the ROPME website and the documents, and you can read them all in multiple languages. And that's where I'd like to stop. Okay, so we have a question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pinniger, for that presentation. Let's check out the questions that we have. I think we got a couple here. Okay. One of our participants asks, how will we see the oceans in 50 or 100 years from now in terms of pH, dissolved oxygen, and other properties? And how can we mitigate or manage these risks?
I mean, some of them are very difficult to mitigate. I mean, obviously, the main way to mitigate them is to reduce emissions globally, which is not a very helpful answer locally. There are some species that can withstand those warm temperatures and will be robust, but it's not looking good, I have to say. The temperature is rising. You're going to get more of these peaks like we had in Kuwait Bay last year. pH, including in Kuwait Bay, is declining. And oxygen, there are small low oxygen areas in the inner ROPME Sea area as well as the outer ROPME Sea area. In terms of oxygen, you can do something about it because it's also partly caused by the breakdown of organic matter. And so you need to remove other stressors, basically. If the animals are already stressed, you might need to fish on them less, for example, or remove chemical pollutants that add additional stress. But it isn't great, I have to say. It's very difficult to mitigate these impacts.
Thank you for that. We have a rather interesting question here, actually, which I don't know if has any bearing or not. Maybe you can enlighten us. Something about solar storms. There's a solar storm that hits Earth. I know these happen sporadically and have happened for probably ever since the Earth existed. What are the effects, and do they have any effect on climate change or the state of the sea, as you described, or anything like that, to your knowledge?
Not directly that I know about. I mean, I have seen papers where, for example, whales and dolphins, there's some weird relationship between sunspots and strandings of dolphins and things like that, but not via climate change particularly. It can affect telecommunications and communications, but I don't know about a link through climate change.
That's fair. I think we have time for one more, if you don't mind. You talked about a risk assessment, and it was done by technical experts, but one of our participants asks, has the public or relevant industries or other stakeholders, like the fishing industry, been part of the assessment? Has there been a more holistic approach, or was it just done by the technical experts?
It was mostly done by technical experts. We did have some people with a slightly more sort of socioeconomic expertise dealing with those risks. And we also drew quite heavily. There was a similar risk assessment carried out for the United Arab Emirates that I was part of. And so we used some of their stakeholders as well. On another project that we've been doing for HSBC, the bank in Oman, we did involve fishermen in the risk assessment that we did there. And for Oman, we did a very detailed risk assessment of which individual fishing fleet and which coastal region could be impacted. And getting stakeholder engagement in those much more detailed risk assessment is probably more appropriate because it's relevant to smaller scales.
Understood. Thank you very much. Your answers are as concise as they were enlightening, and I appreciate that. Thank you. At this stage, I'd like to thank you one more time, Dr. Pinniger, and I'd like to invite the rest of our expert panel. While they step onto the virtual stage as it may, I would like to introduce them. It gives me great pleasure to do so. First, we begin with Ms. Samia Al-Daij. Ms. Al-Daij is a senior environmental specialist from Kuwait with almost 20 years experience in international development, environmental management, and policy analysis. She has worked for the World Bank in the Middle East and North Africa region, and with the United Nations Development Program as a staff member. Ms. Samia, are you there? Can you please join us on the stage? Just to add to that, in 2018, she was a UNDP project coordinator responsible for the production of Kuwait's Climate Change National Adaptation Plan. There she is. Let's make sure that she's on.
A video because the connection is not ideal
Okay.
where I am right now. I am not in Kuwait.
I'd like to welcome you either way. Thank you for joining us,
Thank
Ms.
you.
Samia. Next, we have Dr. Al-Anud Al-Ragam, who I am honored to call my colleague at KISR. She's an associate research scientist at the Coastal Management Program at the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. She has 15 years of experience in the coastal engineering field, focusing on investigating the physical features and environments in the coastal area through physical modeling and fieldwork. Currently, Dr. Al-Anud is working on the Integrated Coastal Zone Management, or ICZM, promoting effective stakeholder engagement to implement sustainable development and building with nature as an alternative to traditional engineering solutions. Welcome, Dr. Al-Anud. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Bassam. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Just making sure also everything is working. Last but not least, Mr. Stephen Mooney is the Senior Climate and Environment Advisor for the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, covering the Middle East and North Africa. He leads a climate team which delivers policy and programming for FCDO throughout the region. Prior to the establishment of FCDO, Mr. Mooney worked as a climate and environment advisor for the UK government, working in Tanzania and Kenya. He has a degree in ecological science and an MA in environmental politics and globalization. Welcome all. Mr. Mooney, can you hear me? Is your mic working okay? Can we just do a quick test?
Greetings all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you all. So what I'm going to do now, as I mentioned earlier, is I'm going to go through what I like to call a lightning round. Okay, we'll go one by one with the questions in order, and then we will repeat that order. Okay, and then at the very end, if there are general questions from the audience, they can ask maybe each of you, specifically, or maybe through Dr. Pinniger as well. And perhaps if you feel like you might want to add to what your colleagues are saying, we could do that as well. Okay, you'll have 3 to 5 minutes to answer. No pressure, all right? And we'll see how this goes, okay? So Dr. Anud, I'd like to start with you. I'd like to start regionally or locally, and then go regionally and then globally, okay? So at a regional level or local level, the threats of sea level rise or increasing temperatures have been highlighted. I mean, they've been talked about, for a long time now. So as far as data is concerned, what data is currently being collected here in Kuwait? And according to you and your interpretation, what is it telling us?
Yep. Well, KISR has a buoy in Kuwait Bay that has been collecting continuous data for the past 5 years. What the buoy provides us with the physical parameters of the water, such as the water temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, and so it gives us an idea of what the water environment that we're dealing with here in Kuwait. Now, because it's real-time data, we get a warning triggered when the values are out of the range or normal range. And this will help us in predicting, for example, fish kill events by identifying potential hypoxia parcels. My colleagues and I, we recently published a paper earlier this year where we reproduced a major fish kill event that occurred in summer 2020 using numerical modeling. And we discussed the coastal management approaches that needs to be taken in order to identify the main trigger and reduce the risk of it occurring in the future. Because as we all know, some of it happens naturally, so we cannot prevent fish kills, but we try to limit the risks. We also have, in the next couple of months, we will be establishing a sea level rise station in accordance to the Global Sea Level Observing System, GLOS. The station will represent the Northern Arabian Gulf in GLOS network, which includes over 90 nations worldwide. And the station adds up to the understanding of regional and local sea level rise impact based on real-time data. In addition to remote sensing images, when we use them simultaneously with real-time data, increases the accuracy for long-term monitoring and also in directing decision makers and relevant stakeholders to take the appropriate action and to sustain our coasts.
Thank you very much. That's great. So you mentioned hypoxia, which fits in great with Dr. Pinniger's presentation, because that's contributes to the harmful algal blooms that we see a lot. And we know that in Kuwait specifically, we've had a huge prevalence of that in the last 10, 20 years specifically? I mean, they've been going on for a while, but at least over the last 20 years or so, we have seen a huge increase in the incidence of HABs and associated fish kills. So that's excellent. And it's great to hear that we'll be doing the tidal gauge also, because sea level rise is another major issue that is linked with climate change. And being a coastal country, Kuwait would be one of the many to suffer from such a consequence. You also mentioned stakeholders, which I'm glad you did, which brings me to Ms. Samia, if I may ask you a question, because the scenarios outlined in the talk, as well as what Dr. Lanud spoke about, and clearly highlight the number of risks that we're facing here. You yourself were involved with the developing of Kuwait's National Adaptation Plan. Could you please maybe provide some insight, elaborate on what that plan is about and why it's important and within the context of what we're talking about today?
Yes, thank you for having me today. Just to add a caveat, I wouldn't really call it a holistic national adaptation plan, more like a roadmap for a national adaptation plan. So what we did basically was do a vulnerability assessment based on the findings that the EPA presented. They've identified 4 key sectors that they anticipate to be the most vulnerable to climate change, which they presented to the UNFCCC in the second national communication. So based on these sectors, we did a vulnerability assessment. And these main sectors, I could just list them. What concerns today's workshop is obviously marine life and fisheries and coastal zones, but also water resources are under pressure and human health. And we can leave that for hopefully another workshop. So the process in general, a national adaptation plan basically is a tool to identify the gaps and put in plans and regulations and prepare the country socioeconomically, infrastructure, whatever, for the impacts of climate change. Because even if we mitigate and even if the entire world reaches net zero carbon emissions in 2050, there's still some expected sea level rise that will happen. So what we did is just through consultations with I wouldn't say most of the key stakeholders, but with the relevant. So obviously the EPA, then you have the Ministry of Public Works, and you have the Supreme Council for Planning, etc., and the Ministry of Electricity and Water. Because at the end of the day, when you do a national adaptation plan, it's a prolonged process, involves lots of consultations, because a plan also requires budgeting and long-term solution. And through the vulnerability assessment, we did identify, related to the marine environment, that increase in sea surface temperature is the most risk that Kuwait will face, followed by increase in salinity and then sea level rise. So the plan would be identifying the key sectors and where the intervention should be. I can go on, but I know I'm conscious about the time. But hope I gave you an overview of what it involves.
Greatly appreciated, Ms. Samia. Thank you. But could you give maybe a ballpark figure? How long do you think before the plan actually becomes a plan and not just the framework for a plan? Is there like a rough estimate maybe?
This is really, it's up to the relevant authorities to take it to the next step. So I think, so climate change right now is not mainstreamed in national development planning, and the climate risk assessment is not a requirement in the current legislation. There is obviously a push towards adopting that, and I think in the next development plan, because there's a 5-year plan and up to the 2035 plan, there is we're heading towards that direction. There is momentum now to include climate risk assessment and climate change impacts in national development planning. But I don't know yet when it will actually become a proper plan with budgets and so on. Yeah.
And I'm sure that is underscored by the upcoming COP26, which we'll talk about a little later, hopefully with Mr. Stephen Mooney. But we'll get to that in a second. Thank you very much for elaborating on that. So yeah, you talked about vulnerability index. You started with the regional, and you expanded that to global, which brings us nicely to my next question to Mr. Stephen. So of course, the ocean plays a huge role in climate regulation. So, and marine nature-based solutions can provide some climate change adaptation resilience. So, could you outline some of the global initiatives? We focus on the regional and local, but what are some of the global initiatives that are looking to better protect our oceans and their biodiversity? Mr. Mooney.
And thank you, Dr. Wassam, for the question. As you say, the oceans play a vital role in the climate systems, both in the sequestration of the carbon to help deal with kind of rising temperatures, but then there is a fallout that kind of has happened from that I think Dr. Pinniger has kind of ran through. But they are also vital, as you say, for adaptation measures. And nature-based solutions will play a very important role, both in the mitigation and adaptation space. And the oceans are also vital globally and beyond climate aspects. They provide livelihoods and economic benefits for our huge and tens of millions of people. So there is a need to protect the oceans across the world. And reflecting on this, they are also under immense pressures from overfishing, from plastics, to then the multiplier probably of climate change on them. So recognizing that there is a need the oceans, there is indeed a very large number of initiatives to protect the oceans. Some of them include the Global Plastic Action Partnership, the GRAP, which is about basically how do you minimize kind of the amount of plastics going into the ocean and what processes are needed both on the supply and demand side to reduce those impacts. There is the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. There is the Friends of Ocean Action, and within that there is kind of various other partnerships, including the Blue Food Partnership, the Blue Recovery Hubs, and initiatives on reducing seafood loss. So there's a huge range of actions taking place. An objective of the UK and our presidency is looking at the 30 by 30 initiative under the Global Oceans Alliance. Mm-hmm. And this is to protect at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. And that's a real kind of key ask, I think, and countries are signing up to that in droves, recognizing the vital importance that these oceans play, both for the global economy and for livelihoods and for future generations. I think it's important to reflect that, these sustainable development goals and these processes aren't just about us now, it's about future generations and giving them the capacity to kind of make the choices and have the resources that they can identify their potential. But there's an equity here that we need to kind of protect this for future generations as well. There is also, the UK is co-leading the International Partnership of Marine Protected Areas, Biodiversity and Climate Change, and also has full membership recently announced at the G7 of the Oceans and Climate Risk Action Alliance, the ORRAA. I have an Irish accent, so I roll my R's, but it's the Oceans Risks Resilience Action Alliance. And this brings together recognizing that this is also not just the kind of the role of governments, it's in a private sector role. And this brings insurance and financial sectors, governments, non-profits and stakeholders from the global south, pioneer finance and insurance products to incentivize investments in nature-based solutions with a focus on protecting these regions and communities that need it most in terms of kind of ocean protection. So there's a range of activities out there, and this is just to highlight some of them. We feel that the 30 by 30 initiative and the Global Oceans Alliance is indeed a very good initiative. And I can talk later on about what also we're doing in regards to kind of COP26 and the role of oceans and nature within it.
Great. See, I'm a fan of nature-based solutions. In fact, Dr. Anoud and I and a team went to the Netherlands a couple of years ago and saw some of their solutions to like the coastal erosion. Obviously, they had the huge flood in the middle of last century. And the way that they're tackling it, because they want to prevent that catastrophe from ever repeating itself, was quite inspirational. Could you just maybe give one or two examples of what kind of nature-based solutions are happening in the UK right now?
Better place to answer kind of
okay.
But I am
sure but
there is a range of activities taking place and kind of learning from them, including kind of looking at kind of rehabilitation of sand dunes. We're looking at ecosystem dynamics. I know that in the North Roads, how they can basically rewild certain areas and build in the salt marshes to cope with kind of future kind of climate change and flooding events, and how you regulate and improve those ecosystem services. And I think in nature-based solutions, it's not just about maintaining what an ecosystem could be, it's actively using that ecosystem to get benefits for all involved. And so how you make those active management decisions that get outward solutions and impacts that we really want to see, whether it's kind of regulating that flood environment, but it also could be, for instance, when you think about your salinity, is there a process in terms of an active management of that ecosystem that can cope with that salinity, but then also deliver a kind of a lower pH base from the water that comes out of it? But I know John and others and guys at CFAS who are very active from DEFRA, the local department, would be able to kind of answer.
Sure. Dr. John, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yes. So in the UK, we have a number of programs. I mean, our ecosystems are equally quite degraded, but there are programs to replant seagrass beds, for example, actively replanting them. And then there are also some sort of win-win type things that are happening, like when they were when they were building a new line for the London Underground, the sediment that came out of the tube basically all got shipped to the Thames estuary to create a new salt marsh. And they actually used it as a sort of, they needed to get rid of the sediment, but they also created a brand new habitat for birds, for mammals, for plants. But it's also happening quite a bit in the Gulf as well. There are projects all over the Gulf replanting seagrasses and mangroves, some quite small scale, but some quite large projects as well. For example, around Bahrain, there's quite big projects. And I'm sure there are in Kuwait as well.
Thank you very much. So just to move along a little bit, I know as scientists and researchers, you can't ever get enough data, and not just data, but quality data, you know, which you can use and expect some kind of great return on. So I'd like to ask you, Dr. Al-Anoud, as far as data and data gaps here in Kuwait, do they exist? Do you think we have the resources that we need to make informed management decisions in relation to these coastal protection or mitigating habitat loss?
Yes, there are data gap, and research is still going and it will be ongoing. But I do believe that we have enough information to pursue Kuwait's vision of a sustainably managed coastal zone. In collaboration with Kuwait's EPA, we completed a 3-year project on establishing an integrated coastal zone management and adaptation framework for Kuwait, which is also interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral. This plan lays the foundation of future management of the coastal zone, and it is also as part of fulfillment of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 14. Now, one of the main outputs of the study is that we surveyed 163 coastal locations and generated coastal vulnerability index maps, which are useful for future development plans of Kuwait, so that the most suitable coastal protection measures can be carried out. I believe that the gap that we have in is not just data, but also science policy interface. We live in a region where the environmental value is not a priority and disregarded in national plans. You know, because the environmental impact is usually long-term, so they don't see it occurring right now, and they don't see the impact or you know how the importance of it. With the accelerated climate crisis, like the rising temperatures, the frequent or more frequent storms that we are experiencing, we need to take action and implement our plans now in order to catch up with this rapid change. And then we can assess and adjust our plans accordingly.
Thank you very much. You're absolutely right. The science policy interface, I think many of us here can relate to that. We speak different languages, and sometimes bridging the gap between the decision maker and the researcher or the scientist can be challenging, to use a euphemism. Okay, but you also mentioned something else that we understand that we can never get enough of, as well as data, which is money. And the cost now could be minuscule compared to the cost in the future. And this leads me to my next question to Ms. Samia. So in terms of adaptation, okay, is there a trade-off? And I'm sure the answer would be yes, but let's just assume, I'm going to ask the question, the trade-off between what we need to spend now or invest now compared to what we potentially could be spending 20 or 30 years down the line. What is that trade-off in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I would just say back in 2006, Nicholas Stern, the World Bank economist, advisor to the British government, published a report from 2000, this is 15 years old, indicating clearly that even though the cost of mitigation adaptation might seem high right now, however, compared to future impacts, it is more feasible to invest now than to deal with the consequences in 30 or 40 or 50 years. So in Kuwait, there was a recent study done by Kuwaiti academics, and they estimated basically that. So if we continue, I mean, with the projected sea level rise, we're not talking about the worst case scenarios. It's expected that there's going to be displacement of a lot of the coastal residential areas. Either the value of the house is going to drop and people will actually have to move to further inwards. And they estimate the cost, if with no action is taken, is to go up to almost $11 billion within the next 30 years. And that's a huge cost. And even now in the States, I mean, at the end of the day, so Kuwait is not densely populated in terms of, we're not like Rio de Janeiro or any of these big coastal cities with, millions of people living by the coast and all sorts of various socioeconomic levels. Action for Kuwait is not costly as it would be in other cities. And even in Miami, a city like Miami now, something called climate gentrification is actually a phenomenon where wealthy people who normally have homes right by the beach are moving to more minority communities because their areas are more elevated, just so that their flood insurance and their would reduce, and they're protecting themselves from impacts of climate change. So this is happening on a macro level and on a micro level, on an individual level. So, as I mentioned, for Kuwait, a wealthy country which doesn't have the population density, adapting now makes a lot more sense. And we're talking about like a hybrid model. Either, you protect existing infrastructure through seawalls, etc. I mean, there are, I think civil engineers and so on will be better able to answer exactly what would work best for Kuwait. Or you can have nature-based solutions. You can expand the coastal area, you can expand the recreational area, and you can, let the natural environment flourish. That can act like a carbon sink, as well as it will have economic value for the population. I mean, you can. One of the things that we did in the World Bank was we do a cost of environmental degradation study, and you value things like recreational value through willingness to pay, or what's called an intrinsic value. So people are willing to put a value on protecting their coastline because they use it recreationally. So I think for a country like Kuwait, adaptation, especially for the coastline, I don't see it as a problem. But we need to also be very, very careful about future developments, because if you recall, all the future developments for Silk City and so on envisage really a city right close to the sea in an area that is quite vulnerable, which is Bubiyan and Sabbiya. And I think this is where proper planning and including with climate risk assessment is quite vital. So at least we don't invest these billions in future development and then have to adjust and pay the price and deal with damaged infrastructure because of sea level rise. And I mean, one of them is probably the big port in Bubiyan. I don't know how that's going to be handled, but I think a lot of environmentalists were a bit skeptical of the decision to build the port there. So we'll see in the future how that's going to be handled.
Thank you. So you reap what you sow. You sow a little bit now. It could flourish in the future, but if you let it go, it's gonna cause a big headache probably, financially, socioeconomically, and all the rest of it. So you mentioned Kuwait there. You mentioned Miami. You mentioned Rio. This is a great segue, I think, for my final question, which goes to Mr. Stephen and COP26. I mean, this has been the talk, pretty much throughout the year. It's been gaining steam now because next month, the UK and together with Italy, they're going to be hosting COP26. And it's an event which many are touting to be kind of a make or break, because it's they're seeing it as possibly the last chance we have before we have runaway climate change situation, so we can get our acts together. Could you maybe describe what COP26 is about and outline the main goals that they're going to be trying to achieve?
Thanks for that, and a difficult act to follow, and Samina, and just to echo what she was saying, that it's cheaper to adapt now than to kind of change everything into the future. So adapt for future climate risk now means you save money into the future. That's there is an economic imperative for adaptation, and to put it another way, today's externalities are tomorrow's risks, right? So it's all about kind of risk management. But that is kind of why we are also locked into a certain degree of warming. Like climate change exists. If emissions continue, the degree of warming will be larger than it is. And so a kind of key outcome and why we are hopeful to deliver an ambitious outcome on COP26 is to keep the Paris Agreement alive, to keep the 1.5 to 2 degrees warming in reach. And to do that, the UK, as the COP presidency, has 4 goals, namely around mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. And collaboration because this is a global phenomenon and it needs global action, even there is local realities on the ground. So on mitigation side, we need to secure a global net zero goal and keep that 1.5 degrees within reach through submissions of every country of ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets. And it was great to see Kuwait yesterday submit their NDC and then for this to be a part of the UNFCCC synthesis report. So it was great to see Kuwait do that. But we need to set out long-term strategies on the pathway to net zero and have high ambition on deforestation to maintain that mitigation gap. So how we can get those emissions down to a level that meets that 1.5 degree target. And as I said, we are, and it's outlined in John's presentation and Samina's intervention, we are kind of still locked into a degree of warming. And so there is a need to work on adaptation. We need to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats from the destructive impacts of climate change, ensuring that the vulnerable countries are supported and to develop credible strategies. And that includes adaptation communications and national adaptation plans, but then also to get access to adaptation finance and to make progress towards the global goal on adaptation. And this is very much important to us. We are seeing the impacts of climate change, so adaptation is important. And then on the finance side, we need to mobilize the finance which developed countries need to deliver on their commitments. So developed countries need to work to deliver on the 100 billion in climate finance per year, to put the finances in place to help developing countries meet the climate challenge and meet the transition to net zero. And all finances should be kind of redirecting their finances in the private sector to take into account these climate risks, to avoid the risk of stranded assets, and to avoid the risk of future financial risk in terms of losing their investments. We need to mobilize the trillions of dollars from the private sector, not just the billions of dollars from the public sector. And then we need collaboration across governments, businesses, civil society to finalize the Paris rulebook and to bring in the largest changes in those high emitting sectors, including on transportation sector, including in energy, and to look at how we can kind of get that goal and keeping 1.5 degrees alive. And this, I know, event is solely is focused on the oceans, and so the UK is also kind of highlighting the role of oceans within this. We're using our COP26 presidency to bring together the community around kind of COP26 through a series of calls for ambitious action on ocean health and resilience. So we're doing this by placing nature at the heart of COP26. We will underscore the critical importance of action for the health of the ocean, the role of marine nature-based solutions, as we've touched on, the importance of protecting the marine environment, and as I said, the 30 by 30 initiative. We will also highlight the need to underpin action ocean research and the transforming ocean science. And we see the role of CFAS and your organization to really strengthen that kind of research base to understand what the future climate impacts are, and also the future kind of solutions to deal with climate change. And collaboration through this is unique to the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, which will take place from 21 to 2030. And this is essential to enhance global ocean observations and deliver accessible information and data. And so that's kind of our role and our mandate. Those oceans will be central to it, but we do have those kind of 4 priority goals around mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. But it's important that we, like, as a COP president, we're about bringing the countries together to come up with this ambitious outcome and come up with an ambitious negotiated agreement, and to keep this 1.5 degree target in line, and to minimize the future risks of greater climate change that could have an even greater impact on people and the oceans around the world.
Very much for that. Much appreciated. So we have quite a few questions from our participants today. So I'm going to just pick a couple. Dr. John, an interesting one, I think, given the world we have been living in for the past couple of years. The pandemic has been front and center for the whole time. And a very, I think, pertinent question is, how has that affected climate change, if at all? What have been the effects, directly or indirectly, from the pandemic on climate change?
Yeah, it's interesting that I mean, I can talk from some of the work that we've been doing in the Caribbean, for example, where in some of the countries they've had to redivert money that would have been used. Well, a lot of those countries were heavily dependent on tourism, and because the tourists stopped coming because of COVID, they didn't have money to adapt to their sea defenses, to put to their climate change prevention type things. And so simply changing the budgets of some countries has made them more vulnerable to climate change because they couldn't put in place the adaptation actions. And I think that's true all over the world, that the COVID outbreak has cost a lot of money that would have been able to be put towards mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. So that's certainly one thing that I've seen in a real sense in the Caribbean. I'm not sure about in the around Kuwait. Maybe some of the others can comment on that.
A more regional perspective and a global perspective, the COVID situation and the pandemic, it did see a reduction in fossil fuel use. So there was a reduction in the overall concentration. What you're also seeing now is emissions levels then kind of rising as the economies are opening and as we're traveling around more. And what also happened was, and I'm sure Kuwait is well aware of this, is that there was a reduction then in the kind of the price of hydrocarbons. And some of the countries, particularly in North Africa, who may not have had the development that Kuwait have, were severely affected by this kind of this lower kind of prices at the same time when they had to then support their economies through the COVID crisis. And so there was a balance of payment issue. But then there is also the opportunity, right? You know, it's hard to see opportunities in this global pandemic, but there is an opportunity perhaps to build back better and greener. And we're looking at the opportunities now to kind of help those countries transition into more kind of sustainable and climate risk integrated scenarios. So in terms of their stimulus packages, looking at how their stimulus packages can be directed towards areas of the economy which need to be the climate risk, so agriculture, so integrating into those sectors, future agricultural scenarios, looking at kind of water efficiencies, looking at how they can manage their ecosystems in a way that delivers sustainable development, and then looking at how you can then use those subsidies and those to transition away from maybe high kind of energy kind of costs, looking at how you can support kind of the green energy system, and looking at kind of decarbonizing. We're looking at decarbonizing in a way that builds on and provides a buffer to some of those more hydrocarbon economies. And there will be a difference, I think, between those which are very developed and those countries which might be coming from a lower developing country. But there is opportunities across the board, and we're seeing that in the UK. We're putting forward a kind of 10-point plan to look at, like, when we come back from kind of COVID, to make sure it is as sustainable and green as possible. So it's hard to see the kind of the optimism there, but we can look at how we can build back better, build back greener from this pandemic.
I think you're on mute.
So thank you, Mr. Stephen, for that. Dr. Anoud, I mentioned earlier our trip to the Netherlands and what we learned there in the form of nature-based solutions. And I know that or at least the idea was, as part of the framework, to mention that as a possible, mitigation measure for Kuwait. Can you give maybe a few examples, such as maybe planting or rehabilitating mangroves in Kuwait, something similar to the engine that we saw, the sandbar that we saw over there? Do you have anything that you could maybe talk Kuwait-centrically about?
Yeah, well, I think what we're trying, especially in the north of Kuwait, Slabikhat Bay, Jahra Bay, and close to Silk City, there's going to be future development in that area, and from the study that has already been done is that mangroves, is a specific type of species, can actually live or flourish in that area. So planting of mangroves is a good nature-based solution to help maybe rehabilitate or circulate or protect the water quality or in that part of Kuwait Bay. Also, we can use seagrass can also be used in different areas. So maybe a study is needed, or this needs to be explored more to see what is the best combination to use specifically in Kuwait Bay, because it is the most stressed right now, and it is there are talks about future development. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. We just got Ms. Samia back. So I'm sorry, guys. I don't mean to, bring up old things, but I need to just step back because I'd like to get Ms. Samia's take on how the pandemic has affected climate change from maybe a more administrative or a more regulatory point of view.
Up until the vaccines, it was on the back burner. That's it's just the issue wasn't. It just wasn't on anybody's mind really as much. However, I think on the plus side is we saw when the world is facing a catastrophe, a crisis, that there might be difficult solutions. I think maybe a lot of people suffered economically, health-wise, whatever. But, international collaboration is possible. And I know a virus is more immediate, but that spirit, I think, can be translated into action for climate change. Because, this decade is really the crucial decade to any mitigation effort has to be done this decade, so we can have a chance of keeping climate change at 1.5 degrees. And I know a lot of countries have these goals to be 23%, reduce their emissions by 23%, increase renewable energy, etc. But this is, we're talking about the developed world and the wealthy countries, and the people bearing the brunt of climate change is the developing world, and usually it's the impoverished communities in the developing world. And the key here is like we saw, the funding came together to resolve this pandemic, and all the great minds in the world, every scientist dropped what they were doing and worked on developing a vaccine, looking at solutions, etc. I think that momentum needs to continue for climate change, and crucially, funding needs to be available. And at the end of the day, I'm speaking to you now from Yemen, a country that is really, really in crisis. So the Yemen, most of the coastal countries of Africa, some Asia, Latin America, etc. These are the countries that will bear the brunt. And it's these local communities that rely so much on fisheries and their livelihood on the marine environment. They're the ones that are going to bear the brunt, and they can't afford, as they are now, to implement some of these drastic mitigation and adaptation actions. And this is where the developed world needs to step up. And there's something called the Green Climate Fund that the world needs $100 billion annually. The developing world needs to provide. The developed world needs to provide the developing world so they can help them adapt to climate change. And I think the funding has been not very forthcoming. We've had a change of administration in the U.S. I'm glad they're back on track now. But that's really what I think. I think the same people who put together this plan to resolve the pandemic, that momentum needs to be translated into climate action.
Somebody once told me that if you want to get some kind of a major paradigm shift or a cultural shift or transformation of any way, it's got to be either inspiration or desperation. And I think the way that everybody came together was a bit on the latter side, but I think the former could work if enough people finally, like you said, get on board and start to see things for what they really are and not think it's a problem down the road, but this is an immediate problem that has to be tackled right now. So thank you for that, Ms. Samia. I have time for one more, and this is kind of an interesting one. Dr. John, if you don't mind, I'll direct it at you, and maybe we could follow on with the other panel members. Basically, the crux of the question is, CO2 gets all the attention, right? Because water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. There are others, things like methane. And why is it always CO2? And what is being done to mitigate or to tackle the problems or the threats caused by or posed by other greenhouse gases?
Yeah, I think CO2 gets the attention because what the scientists do is they calculate everything in terms of CO2 equivalents. So they convert the emissions of methane and nitrous oxide and water vapor into the radiative forcing that in the units of CO2 equivalent. So, for example, we're just doing a project now looking at the emissions from fishing vessels. And even though they emit all sorts of gases, we've had to convert everything into CO2 equivalents. So that's the main reason why people talk so much about CO2. But you're right, methane is a far more powerful greenhouse gas. And there is quite a lot of focus on methane, particularly, and particularly the emissions of methane from agriculture, but also from the marine environment as well. So if you disrupt some marine sediments, you can release a lot of methane, and that can be really bad. And so it's another reason why you want to protect your marine habitats, including things like mangrove beds, because once it's out, it's bad.
Thanks. Mr. Stephen, would you like to follow on with anything? Would you like to elaborate on that?
I don't know if I can elaborate on the science that Dr. Pinniger has done, because as an IPCC author, I think he's very familiar with those CO2. But it is important to recognize, yes, that there is other greenhouse gases, and they are GHGs, the global greenhouse gases, that do contribute to warming and climate change. And that's why we want to see in NDCs, which is nationally determined contributions, as I said, great reference yesterday, and a clear sector strategies, because different sectors will emit different types of greenhouse gases, or global greenhouse gases. So we do want to see those within NDCs, kind of those clear sectoral strategies to kind of look at where the emission reduction targets can be best placed. But it's important also to recognize, yes, that methane is there, and what we're also kind of very worried about is feedback loops, right? As climate change then moves forward, then what is the potential to go beyond thresholds that we will no longer be absorbing kind of global greenhouse gases, and that actually there will be a threshold and feedback loop will be exposed, and more emissions will happen. This is related, I think, to the oceans. Maybe Dr. Piringer can correct me if I'm wrong, but also if you look at the Arctic tundra, where if you go up above a certain level, that it will become a net emitter of methane rather than sequestering those levels. And those are the things we're kind of really kind of key to, and that's why the science is really clear, right? That's why we need more science. That's why we need more research, and that's why we need to know what these kind of thresholds and these feedback loop and feedback mechanisms are. But it is important to recognize that there is wider than just kind of than
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're alluding to a runaway climate change scenario there, right? Where it just more emissions causes warmer climate, therefore more emissions, melting, therefore more emissions, etc. Right? So that's a huge problem. I'd like to thank you all very much for your time. This brings us to the conclusion of this workshop, and thank you all once again, our speakers, panelists, and guests, for your time and invaluable contribution to this event. It was very enlightening and informative. I look forward to the next event. I'd like to remind you all to fill out the survey, please, before you leave, so that we can build on that. And until then, please stay safe and have a great evening, rest of the evening, wherever in the world you are. And look forward to seeing you all again at another event soon. Thank you all very, very much. Have a good one.
Thank you, Bassam. Thank you all. Thank you.